Very happy to announce our next speaker is Uta Heil from Vienna, and the title of her talk is Does Chronology Matter? Where History and Theology Meet.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation and the possibility to give a talk here, and I hope you have enjoyed a little break and have now fresh ears, brain, and open for another presentation. So, does chronology matter? I was asked to deal with this topic because I have dealt already with chronology in some publications. So, in a way, I come back to an old topic I dealt with in former times. And as you are no doubt aware, there has been much dispute about the chronology of the Trinitarian debate, and some things remain unclear and may never be resolved. Therefore, establishing a chronology of the documents on the history of the Arian controversy is a difficult task. Okay, thank you. Especially for the early years before the Council of Nicaea, and it has occupied many scholars since decades. Please, the next slide. So I'm not going to give a research history, but you just give an impression of the many names, and these names may indicate the intensity of the debate. And I have not even mentioned studies that, for example, deal with details such as the authenticity of the Synod of Antioch or the chronology of the emperor's stays, for example, so not on singular topics. And since I cannot go into detail on individual observations and weight arguments in a lecture, I would just like to mention the most important problems regarding the early chronology up to Nicaea. Next slide, please. So here, as this is my estimation, these are the most discussed topics: Licinius and the prohibition of the synods, for example. While the date of Constantine's victory over Licinius was hotly debated in the past, the consensus has been reached on this. But the preceding synod prohibition imposed by Licinius is still an unclear factor. This applies not only to its length, but also to its effect. Recently, Samuel Fernandez has questioned its relevance again and reconstructed events leading up to Nicaea without this ban. Another topic is, did Arius travel to Palestine or then Bithynia, or vice versa, or not at all? So there is also the suggestion by Telford that his travels is an invention of Epiphanius, and you don't have to give much on this information. And the relationship between the letters of Alexander, the two important letters, and their relationship, which one is the first one and the second one, is probably one of the most discussed issues. And another topic is, of course, the famous Thalia of Arius. But this also is a problematic text because, unfortunately, this text cannot be dated. And so, inevitably, some circular arguments emerge here when you have your chronology and rely on the dating of the Thalia and then date with the documents on the basis on your dating of the Thalia. And another topic very intense debated was the schism of Colutus, for example, and is even debated, is this of relevance for the Trinitarian debate at all? It was the suggestion of Winrich Löhr that has nothing to do with the debate of Arius and his position and integrating in this his discussion. And another topic is, of course, the synods of Alexandria. How many synods do we have to suggest? 1, 2, 3, how many and when to date them? And all these aspects, one can add further ones, of course, but I would like to stop here, and I would just to put to your, or remind you of the complex issues here, and if you want to establish a chronology of the events leading to Nicaea, you have to put put all these topics together. You can just not concentrate on one issue and neglect all the others, but you have to make up your minds on all these aspects all together. Well, but for this talk, as I do not have 1 or 2 days time for doing all this, I would like to focus on 2 principal questions and give an example of each. And I left out my planned third one, the dating of Athanasius de Decretis, so the title including after Nicaea, you have to forget for this lecture. It's only leading to Nicaea. So the next slide, please. So one fundamental question is, of course, does the dating of a text change the hermeneutics of the text? Of course, one could point out that the aspect of time and chronology of events and text associated with them, well, is not so important because texts stand for themselves and contain their theological statements and arguments anyway. Therefore, one might state it does not matter whether a letter was written in the year 318 or 22 or 325. We can read the letter and grasp its meaning without being weighed down by chronological details. This question is, of course, particularly relevant for the reception of our text, especially by later theologians or dogmatic theologians, including those of the present day. At a conference organized by me and my colleague in systematic theology at the Catholic faculty in Vienna, Jan Heiner Tück, we discussed precisely this question. Is our historical research on the chronology of text, on historical developments that correct previous accounts and offer new insights, also of theological relevance? So, does the dating of a text change the hermeneutics of a text? Next slide, please. So one example here, and you will piece by piece grasp the understanding of what I tried to create it on this slide. As is well known, an important testimony for the theology of Arius is the already several times mentioned letter of Arius and his supporters to Alexander. Is this his first theological statement or written later on? Opitz follows in his assessment the information given by Epiphanius that the letter was written by Arius in Nicomedia or sent from Nicomedia to Alexandria. This assumes that the debate in Alexandria has already taken place, and including Arius' synodal condemnation, so that Arius had then set out his travels and found supporters, for example, this Eusebius of Nicomedia. And with this support in behind, he had drafted the letter to offer Alexander a kind of theological consensus. While Thomas Kopeček presents a similar interpretation when he sees in this letter a self-representation of Arius for a synod in Bithynia under Eusebius of Nicomedia, which he sent also to Alexandria. William Telfer offers a variation of this interpretation. He rejects the testimony of Epiphanius, but sees still a compromise in this letter, however not in Nicomedia, but in Caesarea. So he combines it with the Palestinian synod mentioned in Sozomenos, and this is precisely why then later on Eusebius of Caesarea afterwards criticizes Alexander for deliberately misrepresenting Arius, and this criticism is based on precisely this compromise in this letter. Well, Samuel Fernandez now confirms the chronology of Opitz, placing the letter to Nicomedia, and he's also relying here on the estimation of Simonetti. He identifies a doctrinal shift in the two letters, namely between Urkunde 1 and Urkunde 6, and so in this letter Arius seems to have softened his doctrine and eliminates ex nihilo, upon the advice of the Eusebians. He sees himself confirmed in this view by the fact that Athanasius refers to the Thalia of Arius in De Synodis 15 as written at the prompting of the Eusebians, so that by analogy this letter was also written at the prompting of the Eusebians. Rowan Williams had come to a completely different conclusion, you know probably. And so let me quote you. You are sitting just right in front of you. I quote, "It is surprising that the text makes no complaint about excommunication or ill treatment, but simply sets out a series of propositions which Alexander is invited to recognize as identical with his own public teaching. The text makes slightly better sense if placed earlier in the controversy before the first major synodal condemnation. If so, this letter is the first actual Arian document we possess." And you see the names placed there that I'm more in supportive of this estimation, and also in the dissertation in print by Matthias Simpel is supporting this position, and Xavier Morales also. And Winrich Löhr is a little bit different. He placed it in the earlier context, but after the first synodal condemnation in Alexandria. Well, it is obvious in my mind that the chronological assessment of this letter also influences the theological interpretation of the document. Is it written rather at the beginning of the debate and even before the escalation and condemnation? Then we can see here the early areas and the initial stage of the dispute. Or is this a later moderate conciliatory letter from Arius to Alexander written to achieve an understanding? Does it present uncompromising thesis by Arius? Or is it not Arius in his original words, but already influenced by the debate and other Arians, such as Eusebius of Nicomedia, for example? So how to interpret the introductory sentences in this letter, quote, "Our faith that our ancestors, which we have learned from you, blessed papas, is this," and it goes further on, and you who know the letter, let me remind you that there's several passages stating the consensus with Alexander. So is this rhetoric to create a consensus? And if it comes from a later period after his condemnation, does Arius here tacitly ignore his condemnation? But isn't that counterproductive and gives the impression of hypocrisy? Well, in this letter, the demarcation is striking, namely against Valentinus, Mani, Sabellius, and Hieracas. So another question is then, is this text to be read strategically? Are these demarcations mentioned primarily in order to build, so to speak, a common front with Alexander against one must fight together? So just a common enemy mentioned to emphasize the common ground, or does this reveal a fundamental interest of Arius? Well, the fact that these aspects fit perfectly in the oral flow of the other text of Arius, this speaks in favor of the letter. Arius has the fundamental question that runs through the text: when and how the Son was begotten by the Father. But I'm not going into the theological interpretation. You know what opinion I prefer. One may decide this way, one may decide the other way, but the main concern is here to use an example for illustration that the chronological considerations also influence the hermeneutics of a text. However, there is also the danger the other way round, that the chronological argument is actually being constructed from the other side. First, you have a hermeneutics of the text, and then the chronology is constructed around. This is particularly difficult in the case of the Arian controversy, since there are also many gaps and unknown and not transmitted documents from the early years here, and so many arguments remain, also arguments e silentio, which, as is well known, is problematic. This leads to the second aspect. A second fundamental question. Does historical development follow one linear trajectory of progression? In German, we like to speak of Entwicklungslinien. The next slide. I think that historical developments were characterized more coincidences and contingencies than they may appear in retrospect. Our search for a clear line of development or one course of progress is based on visual thinking, and one has to be aware of the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous, die Gleichzeitigkeit des Ungleichzeitigen. And the famous historian Reinhard Koselleck also developed the concept of non-simultaneity. Thus, the times appear in an overlapping mode, so that, so to say, different times are present at the same time. Well, this was a concept to apply to larger historical developments and cultural developments, but I think this is also helpful for this small period and thinking about these chronological problems. In the Arian controversy, there is no single line of development of progressive clarification of the issue or of a growing polarization. Not everyone is equally informed about everything, and parallels in content do not necessarily have to indicate a close temporal proximity, even if this is often assumed. And just because someone develops a theological idea in a letter or in a treatise, this idea is not immediately, so to say, the state of the art for further reflections by everyone else. And in addition, to quote Winrich Löhr, we have to admit that the bulk of the source material has vanished and that it may forever be impossible to work out exactly what happened in the first period of the Arian controversy before the Council of Nicaea. And this has consequences, of course, for the possibility or better difficulty of dating the documents. The next slide, please. I mentioned already the one important, most analyzed documents are the two letters of Alexander of Alexandria, and especially the one letter here concentrated on, Urkunde 4b in Opitz, I want to deal with a little bit. And the number 4b indicates that this text is handed down together with the document 4a, so that there is a twofold use of this text already in the ancient times of Alexander. The text Urkunde 4b is a circular letter to other bishops in which Alexander informs them about the condemnation of Arius. We have heard about this already very often. And that a synod of 100 bishops in Egypt and Libya had already taken place, and he asked his addressees to agree with this and not to support Arius and his friends. For what Alexander sharply criticizes, Eusebius of Nicomedia had staged himself as the advocate of Arius. The letter also contains a brief summary of the heresy and a short refutation with biblical quotations as counter-thesis. It should be noted that this letter is not a document of communication of the Egyptian Synod itself, but already a further circular letter that presupposes it. In addition, there is a second use of this circular letter, since Alexander also issued this letter to the presbyters and deacons of Alexandria and Mareotis and asked for signatures, since there are also few apostates here from his perspective. The letter has been handed down with these signatures, so we have Urkunde 4a and Urkunde 4b. One problem is that compared to the other letter from Alexander, the events reported cannot be reconciled, so you always get difficulties. In this letter, Alexander complains about the inference of Eusebius of Nicomedia and does not mention Eusebius of Caesarea, and in the other letter it's the other way around. He mentions Eusebius of Caesarea and not Eusebius of Nicomedia, and so on. So, in addition, there is, of course, probably the thesis that this letter was not written by Alexander, but by Athanasius, and the chronological consequences taken out of these theses are not really thought about. So, this is an additional problem. Well, while Opitz dates it quite at the beginning of the controversy, Rowan Williams thinks that it fits better in the period after the fall of Licinius and is indeed a document of this very late stage. So they have a really disparate, separate chronological staging of this document. So you believe that this the document of the traveling of Osius to Alexandria and this synod at this late stage and after Constantine delivered his letter. If this is correct, there is of course any document of any earlier condemnation of Arius in the beginning of the dispute, and the synod of 100 bishops mentioned in this Urkunde 4b is one of the middle of the Arian dispute. And so then this is a document of a later third synod under Alexander and Osius. Where you see here in the slide that Thomas Böhm, myself, and Windrich Löhr again placed this document at the beginning of the Arian controversy. The arguments need not be repeated here. Samuel Fernandez, on the other hand, and now Matthias Simpel, also favors the line dating the document in the later period. Samuel Fernandez is here joining Rowan Williams here. And Matthias Simpel even goes one step further, relying here on Xavier Morales. For Simpel, this is a very late document, even very shortly before Nicaea and even after the Synod of Antioch in 324-5. And the reason for this are the more concise theology and the intensive use of the Usia terminology, and it's precisely because of this that the text should be placed in the proximity to the Nicene Creed, because in this Urkunde you have the Usia terminology as a preparation to the decisions of Nicaea. However, I think that one should argue more cautiously here, and developments do not proceed in a linear fashion, and some intersect, some fade away, and the idea that the refutation of the Arian thesis in this letter is more concise is not apparent to my mind. The big issue, of course, is the assessment that the terminology of Usia and how to interpret this. Urkunde 4b actually offers Arian thesis that the Son is not homoios kat Usian, and that he is xenos tes tu tou Usias, and that he is anhomoios te Usia tu patros. So this text is really has many terms related to the terminology with Usia. And but this seems that the text is to be interpreted a direct preparation of the Synod of Nicaea. One should note that it was probably Eusebius of Nicomedia who introduced this language and these terms to the debate, and there is this famous different document, Urkunde 8, and which can be read in this respect, that the Son is not ectes Usias tu patros, and different explicitly stated by Eusebius of Nicomedia, and he even integrates in his quotation of Proverbs 8:22 the Usia terminology. And so this is the already mentioned letter of Eusebius of Nicomedia to Paulinus of Tyrus, in which he asks him finally to take a stand in the Arian controversy. So I do not here want to advocate a different chronological order based on other parallels in content, but I only want to point out to the problem that the evidence is not so clear-cut and cannot be interpreted chronologically, because this letter of Eusebius also, including the Usia terminology, has to be dated much earlier. So what to make with this? Texts with similar content may be close together in time, but they don't have to be. So if Eusebius of Nicomedia and his activities are the actual background for this letter, then the appearance of the terminology of Usia in this text is not surprising, but is explained all the more. A temporal proximity to Nicaea a few weeks later does not actually explain the phenomenon. So, a very short summary. My contribution was intended to address the problem of how historical classifications and dating of text influences its interpretation. Is our painstaking historical research relevant, and does it contribute to an understanding of a text? Or can we just as well save ourselves the trouble and simply take a note of the content of the text? Doesn't matter when to date it. The question arises particularly in such questions as the chronology of the Arian controversy, when we are talking about only a few months or a few years. Nevertheless, I hope to have shown, especially with regard to the letter of Arius, how much a dating also influences the hermeneutics of a text, and this is also obvious in the other example, but even more striking is in this context, to which conversely an interpretation of the context influences the dating of the text. So, since we have to take into account many gaps in tradition, and since often a silencio is to be argued, I would like to conclude by pleading in favor of at least offering one's own thesis conditionally and not as the only possible interpretation. In view of the extant sources, this is academically dishonest. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, 5 minutes. So we have 5 minutes for questions.
I have confronted you with too many chronological details.
Very simple remark, because we discussed questions of letters in those days. It's a striking fact that we have all fragmentary transmission of letters, because the original letter is dated. And here we have serious problems. For example, the famous invitation to Nicaea is a pure fragment, and that is one of the problems in the controversy.
Yeah, thank you. That this often, of course, relates to the transmission, that we do not have the dating, and the introductory remarks are missing, or the concluding where could appear a dating, and this makes it even more complicated, besides all the letters which are lost. So also those letters we have, they have not clear-cut evidence about their Sitz im Leben, how it is in German called.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I wanted to hear what do you think, that is, to what extent all these documents are part of the same chain, in the sense that when we speak about the trajectory and so on, we have the idea that all the documents belong to the same controversy, so to say, or to the same chain. But for example, people as George of Nicaea, that is, I am trying to support your second answer. That is, we cannot construct the chronology based on the idea of our idea of the trajectory, because we don't know if all these documents belong to the same chain.
Yeah, that is a good additional remark, and even complicates the situation. So if you look at the transmission, so we have some documents which are taken from Eusebius and his works, and others are from Athanasius, so we have complete different traditions, and you know that right from the beginning of the controversy, all parties, but put it in question mark, in quotation mark, please, they themselves collected documents to have material for argumentation. And so we have different collection of argumentation, and it would be very good if we would have more of it transmitted, so we have only slight hints of it, and the Sabinius collection can only be guessed about the content. And so we have always the documents transmitted which with a certain tendency, but not I think it's the documents have a mixture, so also Alexander or Athanasius, they collect, of course, also documents of their opponents to have text to argue against with. So we can see this in the collection of the letters and treatises of Athanasius, especially in the strange Petitiones Arianorum from the very later. So it is a very fragmentary transmission, and it can best be explained that it's just a treatise or so a kind of protocol collected for making something out of it in later times. So it's not just collecting one's own documents, but especially those most controversial of the other side, to have material to argue against it.
Well, one second remark. I don't want to be the mediator between positions, but perhaps the idea that only one date should be linked with one letter is also a little bit misleading, because these letters were circulating. And so perhaps at certain places, certain earlier letters were brought off later. That makes things also quite complicated. But I've never asked myself the question, perhaps I could a later dating accept as a form of the letter is brought again to the podium, or is again brought into circulation. That might be something we should think, because we have always these alternatives, early, late, and that might be something we should discuss.
Yeah, thank you very much. This even complicates our picture, and but I think one really has to take this serious, because even the simple transmission and the letter carrier takes time to send a letter from Alexandria to somewhere, and even then to proceed it from place B to place C, and then and collecting, and then adding documents, and then sending back, or what about the answers, and there has been some crossing perhaps, and so it would be, but it's of course fictitious to have this aspect added to it. But there is more fluidity in the dating, I think one should accept. And this makes it even more complicated to have a dating of a text, yes. So it's not, perhaps the best way not to have just one single date. So this is sent in, April the 5th or so. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. We come now to our second speaker, Mark DelCogliano, and he is Associate Professor for Theology at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, and I'm happy that you are here and taking the long road here, and the talk is yours, and there is a handout passing through, but one can also follow the handout here on the screen.
Yes. Thank you. So there is a handout coming around, but all the texts are also on the screen here. In the 370s, there was an explosion of Nicene Christological writing. In this decade, there were figures such as Athanasius, Basil, Apollinarius, and Diodor, and others, who wrote a number of texts on various Christological teachings that they deemed aberrant. And by the end of the same decade, Apollinaris' own views had sparked what would become a very long-lasting anti-Apollinarian tradition of writing, which goes into the 5th century and beyond. In the 380s, we have Gregory of Nyssa, Philip Nazianzen, Ambrose of Milan, Theodore of Mopsuestia, and others who are writing Christological texts that are combating the views of Eunomius, of Apollinarius, and other Christological writers. And all these texts I'm talking about that emerged in the 370s and the 380s are all texts that are dedicated to a Christological topic. So it's the 370s and 380s that mark the first widespread articulation of a pro-Nicene Christological tradition in both the East and West. So I don't mean to say that this pro-Nicene Christological tradition was monolithic. Obviously it was not. But among those who did proclaimed adherence to Nicaea, there are certain shared Christological principles. And I'll just list a few of these here. So the first is that Christ actually did consist of two distinct elements, one human and one divine. There's lots of terminology for that. Second idea is that Christ's divine element was at the same level as that of the Father, so the homoousios. And the third principle is that the Word remains impassible even in the Incarnation. And as we'll see in this paper, it's that third one, which is a real kind of preoccupation for them. And so these principles that we find in the 370s and the 380s are inherited from an earlier formative period in the development of Nicene Christology. And so this period is running from the 320s to the 360s. And this is when Nicene Christology was born. So this early Nicene Christology was undoubtedly shaped by the parameters that were inherited from 3rd century debates, such as opposition to Docetism, Sabellianism, the Paul of Samosata, and so forth. But I call it early Nicene Christology because it's Nicene, and by that it means that it's motivated by certain anti-Arian concerns. And every time I use Arian in this paper, it's in scare quotes, so, because it's a more complicated term. So in the most general terms, those three principles that I mentioned earlier were all formulated and they came to be emphasized in the course of these Nicene debates with Arians of these various stripes. It's particularly difficult to reconstruct Arian Christology that served as the foil for the development of early Nicene Christology. So as we know, the documents that survived are very sparse and fragmentary, and even in that case, they don't often speak about the incarnational issues. But I think a key point, for our purposes, is that the Arians assumed that it was by definition impossible for the utterly transcendent God to become incarnate. But the Word, who is not true God, has a kind of divinity that's able to become incarnate. So a different level of a divinity, one that can enter into the physical world. So Nicenes thought that this sort of an Arian view of the Word implied that the Word was mutable, than passible. So the God is subject to suffering in the incarnation. And of course, that this is a big obstacle, like a Nicene thought. So what this paper is trying to investigate is this earliest period of Nicene Christology. So the earliest that one can recover from the initial period of its development, and I mean from the outbreak of the Arian controversy, and for the purposes of this paper, so I'm going to the year 337, when Emperor Constantine died. So the time today permits me only to examine some of the surviving evidence, and there's not a lot of surviving evidence at all. So then first I will discuss Alexander of Alexandria's pre-Nicene letters, along with the letter of the Synod of Antioch, which of course Alexander had a role in shaping. And then second, I will look at Alexander's encyclical letter, which was likely ghost-written by Athanasius. And then third, I'm going to examine the letter of Constantine to Arius and his associates. So a fuller version of this paper would also look at the fragments of Eustathius of Antioch, at the festal letters of Athanasius through the year 337, and also Athanasius's on the Incarnation. Actually, I want to quote a passage from the Incarnation at the end of the paper. There are very few passages in Alexander's letters that make an explicit Christological statement. So you have these here on the first page of the handout. So in the letter to Alexander of Byzantium, he says, "Our Lord Jesus Christ, in reality and not in appearance, bore a body from the Theotokos Mary, dwelt among the human race, was crucified and died. But his own divinity was not lessened because of these things." His letter to Philogenus of Antioch is a version of his letter to Alexander, and it exists only in Syriac. And this version reads, "Our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ put on a body from the Theotokos Mary, so that he might go toward the human race." And there is a Christological statement in the letter of the Synod of Antioch, which reads, "But this Son, God the Word, was also born in the flesh from the Theotokos Mary, and put on a body, and suffered, and died, and rose from the dead." So I want to make a number of observations about these texts. So the first thing to note is whom Alexander identifies as the subject of the Incarnation. In his letters to Alexander and Philogenus, even though he had just mentioned a Father and a Son, when it comes to speak of the Incarnation, the subject of the verbs is Christ, is Jesus Christ. Since elsewhere, Alexander identifies Jesus Christ with the Word, with the Son of God, his preference for speaking about Jesus Christ as the subject of the Incarnation may be the result of a kind of reflexive piety. In the synodical letter, it has the Son, the Word of God, as the subject of the Incarnation, so as the subject of the verbs. So there's a strict identity there. Second thing to note is Alexander's concept of the Incarnation. So concept or a model or an underlying understanding or like a metaphor, whatever it is. So where the letter to Alexander speaks of Christ as having bore the body from Mary. And the Greek term there is phorassos, from Pharaoh. The letter to Philogonus and the synodal letters say that Christ put on, or he clothed himself, lavesh, in Syriac, with the body from Mary. So as the letter to Philogonus and the synodical letter only survive in Syriac, so it's highly likely that lavesh is simply a translation of the Greek term Pharaoh. So it's a vague language. There are a few verbs in Greek which are less vague, but I think there's a concept of incarnation that's behind using that verb here to having bore a body. So the concept is that the word takes on a new state in the incarnation. And so what does this state involve? It involves having a body or being in possession of a body that he did not have previously. So the reason why the word has to take on a body is clear enough. So it's only by bearing a body that the word can actually dwell among human beings, suffer and die. So this brings me to my third point. The passage from the letter to Alexander ends with the remark, but his own divinity was not lessened because of these things. So the bearing a body and being engaged in human experiences like suffering and dying, but do not have a negative impact on the word. Alexander is pretty clear about this. But he merely asserts it. He does not explain how or why this happens, so that how the word avoids being affected by the sufferings of Christ simply because he bears a body. At any rate, his main concern to protect the fully divine word from being implicated in the sufferings of Christ is clear. There's a fourth comment to make about Alexander before moving on. So he calls Mary Theotokos, the mother of God, for the God-bearer. So one must be careful not to interpret Alexander's use of this term as the same as Cyril's over a century later. But I think it is fair to say that in his usage, it's an indication of Alexander's belief that it's the Word who is the agent of Christ's actions and the subject of his human experiences. It's the Word who is born of Mary. It's the Word who bears the body, enabling him to suffer and die. In his letter to Sylvester of Rome, Alexander applies the Philippians hymn to the Word, saying that it is the Word, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who emptied himself, took the form of a slave, and humbled himself unto death. So Alexander's encyclical letter, which is probably written by Athanasius, as has been confirmed most recently by Javier Morales. Thank you. Now there's only one passage in his letter which even touches upon the incarnation, and it's in a place where Alexander is affirming the immutability of the Word. So he says, and the Word did not change even when he became a human being. So the subject of the incarnation, again, is the Word, and the concept of the incarnation is the Word becoming the human being. So it's genomos anthropos, right? So how are we to understand this concept? So given his insistence on the immutability of the Word, he must mean that the Word, while remaining what he is, also becomes something else, so namely a human being. He doesn't explain this anymore. It's a single passage. So we don't know exactly what he means here, but this concept is not necessarily in tension with the idea of the Word like coming to possess a human body. But the idea of becoming something is different from possessing something. So there's a different underlying kind of model there. And so unlike the other texts that we have already examined, so here Alexander actually offers a scriptural argument for why the why immutability must be ascribed to the Word even in the Incarnation. And the key verse for him is Hebrews 13:8. So where it said that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and for all ages. Since the subject of the statement is Jesus Christ, so a title that denotes for Alexander the Word in his incarnate state, unlike verses like Malachi 3:6, which refer to the pre-incarnate Word. So Alexander applies this to the incarnate Word. So it's a strict scriptural proof. So aside from offering this scriptural proof, he does not try to explain how or why the Word can remain immutable when incarnate. And this is an omission that we've also found in the text that we've already examined. So on to our last letter for today, and this is the letter of Constantine that was written to Arius and his allies. So I think you can go to the next page. Yeah, great, thank you. So in this letter, Constantine replied. So this was written around probably 333 or 334, and this is when the emperor was engaged in efforts to achieve Arius's reconciliation with the Alexandrian Church. In his letter, Constantine replies to a letter of Arius that is now lost, but the emperor actually quotes this letter extensively and otherwise reports what Arius says. So there's a section of the letter where Constantine demands Arius to give proof of his faith if he wants to be reconciled with the church. And then Constantine lists 4 teachings that Arius might offer to prove his faith, and in each case the emperor affirms that he would agree with that teaching. So I labeled those 1 through 4 there from the handout. There are some scholars who think that these 4 teachings are being quoted by Constantine, and they are actually kind of snippets of Arius' letter. But I think this is incorrect. And my chief reason for this is that the second teaching says that the logos of the divine Nicaea is anarchon, so without beginning. So the idea that the Word that has a beginning seems kind of central for Arius, and so I can't imagine him backing off that claim even when he's trying to be reconciled to the church. So the Arius would have endorsed the first teaching that there's only one God, but there's no way to know whether he would have subscribed to the third and the fourth teachings, which are about the incarnation. And so accordingly, I'm taking the teachings on the incarnation in this section of Constantine's letter as evidence of the Nicene position, so whether it was articulated by the emperor himself or a ghostwriter. The fourth teaching is a garbled expression of spirit Christology, where where the divine element in Christ is understood as the Spirit. So it's a garbled expression, so I'm not going to try to unpack it today. So I'll focus on the third teaching. And here he speaks of the xenia of the body for the economy of the divine operations. Xenia of the body. I think here we have a case of an exegetical genitive. So the body is the xenia. So this term refers to a place where hospitality is offered. And thus Constantine is speaking of the body of Christ as a lodging or as a guest room. So it's a striking metaphor. The Word leaves his home, his native heavenly realm, and he takes up residence on earth as a guest in a human body. And so this is a different concept that we've seen from those in the previous two texts. So it's not a case of a becoming something, it's not a case of a possessing something, but it's a relocation, it's a placement, it's a replacement in a sense. So the Word is moving from one location and is now residing in a different location. So again, this concept is not necessarily in tension with the other two, but there is a different underlying model there. So it's interesting to note that this concept of the body as a xenia, as a guest lodging, does not get a lot of traction in later Nicene authors, and this may be because the concept is problematic, and that a person doesn't stay permanently in a guest lodging, but you check out of the hotel once your visit's over, right? So that's maybe, so it's possibly why that one didn't have a long afterlife. So this third teaching also makes it clear what the purpose of the Word's placement in the body is. So as to accomplish the economy of the divine operations. So this must refer to Christ's suffering, death, and resurrection for human salvation. And in a different part of the letter, but the emperor clarifies why the word needed a body for the economy of salvation. So he begins by agreeing with Arius that Christ suffered for the sake of human beings. And then he explains how this has happened. So he says that the Word was sent in bodily form. So the concept of incarnation here is also a kind of a relocation. So you're sent from one place to another place. Okay? And so he doesn't explain this, but it's presumable, like Constantine thinks thinks the Word became a guest in a human body, since the Word himself is impassible, but he needs a human body in order to experience the suffering and death on earth. So at this point, Constantine inserts an objection from Arius. So whether this is a quotation from that lost letter or it's an imagined quotation, imagined objection, I don't know, but it reads like this. So the word suffering while lodging in the body seems to diminish him in some respect. And so, but the theological here is that the word contact with the body then his sufferings might have a negative impact on the Word, somehow lowering or lessening his divinity. So in response, Constantine draws a parallel between God's omnipresence in the material world and the Word's presence in his human body. So just as God is not wounded or made inferior in any way by being omnipresent in the world, so too the Word is not harmed in any way by his presence in the body. So for Constantine then the incarnation involves no special mode of divine presence. Rather, the Word is present in the body as God is present everywhere in the world, in the universe. And here's where I want to make a comment on Athanasius, because it's on the incarnation that we find a very similar explanation of the relationship between the Word and the body. So Athanasius insists that the Word is not enclosed in or bound to the body, but rather he contains everything and is in everything by his power. And so, just as the Word, the Word is present in the body in the same manner that he is present in all things. So, just as the Word is not corrupted by being in everything by his power, so too he does not suffer or become polluted by being in the body. Rather, on the contrary, the Word actually purifies and sanctifies the human body. So in conclusion, the main occupation of these early Nicene Christological texts that we have examined today is the immutability of the Word in the Incarnation, since it is the fully divine, impassible Word who is the subject of the Incarnation. The main task of these early Nicenes was to affirm how the Word was not implicated in the sufferings of Jesus Christ. So the underlying concept of each Nicene theologian that implicitly takes on this task by explaining how the human and divine elements in Christ are related. Some concepts, such as possessing or being placed in the body, seem like designed to establish a kind of a barrier between the Word and the body's sufferings. Other concepts, such as becoming, are less effective in this regard. But it seems overall, though, that early Nicene theologians appear to have found it very difficult to explain in an explicit manner how the Word did not experience any change in the Incarnation. So the only theological explanation that emerges in the period before 337 is that the Word's presence in the body is a species of divine omnipresence. So it would fall to a later generation of Nicene theologians to improve upon this inventive but inadequate explanation. Thank you.
Are we running out of time, or have one question, two questions?
Couple
Questions. Please.
Thank you very much indeed. Two very short questions. One is on your remarks on the second point made by Constantine.
Yeah.
I've taken that simply to mean that Arius would be quite free to say there is a logos intrinsic to the ousia of God, which is eternal. And he more or less says that in the Philia.
Okay.
So I suspect that Arius may have been using that tactic to say, of course, I believe the eternity of the divine logos.
Okay.
Constantine takes him at his word of not being very bright.
Right.
Something else.
Yeah.
So I think there is a way.
Okay, yeah.
Second point, though, is just a speculative open question about the history of the German Theotokos. It's already been presented as traditional in Alexandria, presumably in Antioch as well. There's a fragment of her in the rightly ascribed to Pierius in the 3rd century, which appears to use the term, which might suggest that Alexandria is the source of this. In that context, of course, it won't mean what it means in the later Christological context.
Right.
But that it's already circulating seems to be interesting. I don't think I've got anything to say about these.
Yeah, so if I had had more time to prepare, like I would have looked into the history of that term, because I don't think Alexander is the first one to use it, but I'm not sure really. Yeah, but that's a good way to see what sort of 3rd century ideas are being inherited by the early Nicenes. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. I want to ask you a small question about the letter of Constantine to Arius and his companions. There, you mentioned the somatos xenia. Did you find some common elements from this term too, the term idiopiesis, sarkos, from St. Cyril of Alexandria? After that.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, like you're asking if the language of the Xenia terms up in Cyril. Okay, I'm not sure that I searched. I looked for kind of later 4th century usage of that, and did not find much. But that'd be interesting to see if it kind of reappears in Cyril's there. That's real helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for your presentation. It's really helpful. I was wondering if you could kind of help me understand the dialectic of like appearance that we find in these letters, specifically the first letter where Alexander says that Jesus Christ bore a body in reality, not in appearance.
Right.
And then the 4th letter, drawing upon the language of Philippians, the word takes the form of a slave, being found as human in appearance.
Right.
So what do we do with that kind of dialectic between Jesus Christ bore a body not in appearance but in reality, and then the language of the word appearing as a human? How do we kind of understand that? That's my question.
Yeah, so I have kind of 3 things like immediately come to mind there. So in that first passage, which to Alexander, so I think that phrase, like in reality, and not in appearance, is an anti-docetic phrase there. So the second one, that's a translation like of the Philippians. So we don't remember about the underlying Greek there myself at the moment, but that's where that's coming from. So it's not the same usage. And there, if you look at Athanasius on the Incarnation, like he often speaks of the Incarnation like as an appearance. Epiphania is one, or what's the other? I can't think of the word off the top of my head, but so that's another. So it's another kind of concept that's used by these early Nicenes. As appearing in flesh. Yeah.
So, there is one question.
Yes, excellent presentation. I just wanted to react about the idiopoiesis of Cyril and the link with the Xenia, and ask if you are poiesis that we have in Syria is very much like Athanasius, because Athanasius has this idea of idios, and the body was the word's idios body. So there is an appropriation of the humanity by the word, and then Cyril will pick up this Christology by Athanasius. But Xenia, it's very interesting because we have another letter by Constantine where he uses, the translator, the Greek translator, uses another word very close to that. I think it's oikesis, the letter to Nicaea, to the Church of Nicaea.
Okay.
And my hypothesis is that perhaps Constantine heard Eustachius at Nicaea speaking of the world, and in Eustachius, in the fragments, we only have fragments, we have this idea of this spirit Christology, and this idea of the spirit, the divine spirit lodging in the body. And I think we have two traditions, very different traditions. Athanasius and Cyril, with this idea of appropriation of the body, and and the other tradition, which is the Spirit of God lodging itself in a thomas, in a body that is also a spot, space, as you demonstrated. And my question would be, where do you spot Alexander? Do you think that the Soma Forestas goes towards Eustathius or towards this tradition of the proper idios?
So I see Alexander being more, so probably closer to the Xenian tradition. I have to think about that more, but if you put me on the spot here, so I'm going to say something. That's what I was saying. Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your
Okay,
presentation.
thank you.